Hello everyone and welcome to our last MDR Cyber digital session of 2020. I'm Joe Hancock, I'm a partner and head of MDR Cyber, which is the cybersecurity and digital investigations practice here at the law firm Mishcon. Today we are launching our State of Cybercrime report, looking at some of the key themes in cybercrime for 2020 and also taking a look forward to the future. So I'm joined by three great speakers today. So first of all, Louise, who is the head of cyber operations and intelligence at Jacobs. Till February 19, Louise headed up the UK's largest cybercrime unit as a senior detective in the Metropolitan Police. Also joined by Ben, who's a partner in our white collar crime and investigations group here at Mishcon. He's highly experienced in cybercrime investigations and fraud and has covered everything from Abu Hamza to Julian Assange. And then finally, last but very much not least, is Mark, who's the head of cyber intelligence within MDR Cyber here. Mark previously worked in the threat intelligence field and then spent a large amount of his career at the National Crime Agency, focusing on cybercrime issues. Mark is going to talk through the report today, give you some of the headlines, and then we're going to have a Q&A with Ben, Louise and Mark, where we'll talk a bit about the report in detail. So with all of that, over to Mark.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks everyone for joining us today. What are the key themes that have punctuated 2020? Well, firstly, we saw as the coronavirus pandemic unfolded, we saw the immediate and rapid shift of cybercriminals to use phishing lures, which followed these events. They exploited coronavirus themes to get victims to interact with their emails. Lines blurred between criminals and state-sponsored crime in particular. The US accused North Korea of acquisitive cybercrime, particularly against cryptocurrency exchanges. We also saw the increased use of anti-money laundering laws against cryptocurrencies. Estimates range up to $2.8 billion of criminal money that was moved in cryptocurrency in the year. Cyber-enabled fraud jumped. Certainly in the UK, we saw statistics which showed big and sustained increases between May and July. It rose about 45%. But probably the biggest issue of the year for most businesses was the threat of big game or targeted ransomware attacks. These attacks now are not just the work of individual groups. This is a maturing marketplace where you find services being offered by various different groups. So you might find one group offering initial access to a network and then selling it to another. But I suppose the good news around this is that the vast majority of these attacks use known weaknesses, at least to get into networks. And for those doing security right, it should be able to mitigate the impacts. So what's driving this? Well, this is facilitated, has been facilitated somewhat for the last few years by anonymous payments or pseudo-anonymous payments through cryptocurrencies, but also a willingness of businesses, in some cases unavoidably, to pay the ransoms. And in the year we heard speculation, I'd say it wasn't confirmed, of ransoms being paid of $10 million by Garmin in August and $2.3 million by Travelex in January. This has all made governments sit up and start taking notice. We've seen in the year the EU introduced sanctions against cyber attackers, and the US, who had been sanctioning cyber criminals for some time, reiterated their intention to enforce sanctions. In October, they released an advisory stating that they would enforce sanctions against those that paid sanctioned ransomware groups. So in a kind of development of 2020, I think one of the newer developments that we've seen, again, it didn't quite start in 2020, but it's the development in 2020 was the mass adoption of dual ransoms, where attackers would not only request ransoms for decrypting files, but they would also steal your files and request another fee not to leak them publicly. In another good news story, there are opportunities if victims move fast to recover the money. So we've worked with our lawyers this year to repatriate several £1 million of stolen funds, helped by court orders, which allowed us to identify wrongdoers and freeze assets, ultimately returning millions of pounds worth of stolen funds. So that's kind of the whirlwind tour of 2020. But what does all this mean for the future? So the report that we're publishing next week takes a forward look at possible futures as well by using the established process of scenario planning. And that led us to hypothesize 4 potential scenarios. And these scenarios are not meant to perfectly predict the future, but they do describe possible characteristics of the future So in reality, we're likely to see elements of each future in different contexts. And you may look at these and decide that actually we're in one of these 4 different scenarios already, or we're more in one than the other. If we think about where we are and where we're heading, my personal opinion is I think we're going from the top right there, survival of the fittest, where we have a smaller group of elite cyber criminals, towards a more chaotic landscape where both sophisticated and low-skilled attackers coexist, and that would be largely due to the global economic turndown. And with that, I'll hand you over to Joe and the panel to ask some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's fascinating canter through. I guess the kind of opening question for everyone really, what really has kind of surprised you about cybercrime in 2020? Is there anything you've seen this year that you didn't expect?
I'm not surprised that we've seen so much cybercrime in 2020, but from a criminal justice perspective, I'm afraid I remain surprised that so little is being done to combat it. Fair
enough. Louise, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo what Ben is saying. And I think what we have found most surprising about cybercrime this year has just been the absolute professionalisation, I think, of ransomware.
Do you think sanctions are an effective way of regulating the kind of cybercrime, in particular ransomware market? It's something we see a lot of, and also James asked a question around OFAC and the speed of resolution here in the chat. And if Ben, if you could perhaps give us some comments on this.
The short answer and the uncontroversial answer is probably that I'm not sure we really know, because the empirical data is really not there yet on the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, as you will all know. To me, the issue is how do we see sanctions working, particularly sanctions directed against individuals outside the cybercrime arena. And what we do know is that where the targets, the designated persons, are outside the UK, outside the EU, and in the case of those individuals named in the EU sanctions are in Russia and in China, the sanctions really have a pretty limited effect. And in my view, the reason for that is that individual sanctions only really work if the target has legitimate interests or does business overseas. In other words, business outside Russia or business outside China. It could be said that the sanctions regime at the moment certainly is largely symbolic, where the targets remain well beyond the reach of this jurisdiction or indeed any other jurisdiction. I think the more interesting question, and I'll try and deal with this briefly, is of course the very recent announcement from the US Treasury, from OFAC. What the OFAC guidance says, for those who've not come across it, is companies that facilitate ransomware payments to cyber actors on behalf of victims, including financial institutions, cyber insurance firms, and companies involved in digital forensics and incident response, not only encourage future ransomware payments demands, but may also risk violating OFAC regulations. But it's a pretty clear shot across the bows that if you're involved, for example, as an insurance company, in facilitating a ransomware payment, that you may fall foul of the OFAC sanctions regime.
If we're going to accept that people can't pay or don't pay, and therefore there are going to be consequences, effectively, does the state have some obligation then to jump in and support businesses? Interesting point. Open that up to the panel if they have any views.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a point that I would have made as well. What level of government interference into very important, complex, strategic business decisions is appropriate, and what is the compensation package for these businesses that would ultimately fold? And I think there's also another issue around enforcement. How would enforcement be implemented? We talk about the OFAC list. How is a business supposed to know exactly who's on it and who they're even, negotiating with?
Yeah,
because quite often you don't know.
Yeah,
that's certainly a problem. because and these groups are not necessarily going to tell you who they are.
No.
Right, and attribution is hard, and in the case of Garmin, that was the point in question, is like, is this wasted locker, is it linked to Evil Core or not? But I think actually probably, and Ben, you may be able to tell me, would OFAC care? If you've paid a sanctioned group, even if you didn't know, I don't think they'd care.
No,
I think they'd say that's too bad.
It's not a defence to say I didn't know they're on the list, but there may be an issue about whether they're on the list, and that's where you start to look at the complex, factual, fact-sensitive issue of, is this group genuinely a new group or new entity or new collection of individuals that are conducting this attack, who have previously not been sanctioned, and therefore presumably I might not myself be the subject of civil fines and recovery if I pay them, or are they in fact connected to another group and they're just calling themselves something different?
Again, for the kind of the whole panel, but happy for anyone who's taking it. What do you think the main issues are around the law enforcement actions or enforcing actions against cybercrime in the UK at the moment? What's perhaps preventing this happening?
In a word, resources.
Okay.
I'd say the most damaging groups, it's probably international cooperation and protection and corruption. So if you look at that Evil Core group, the group, the individuals behind them are well known and with high confidence, but they're not being arrested and they're not being extradited. And you can only really think there's a couple of reasons for that, and I think protection of those individuals is probably local corruption issues.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. I was directly involved in an investigation for several years, specifically against Evil Core, and I know Maxim Yukabets is on the OFAC list, and for very good reason. These people, they don't leave their own jurisdiction, and they certainly don't travel to a country where there's any risk of them being extradited. In terms of collaboration, there is extensive collaboration that goes on currently between UK law enforcement and across Europol and with the Five Eyes community. But, in my experience, there's still an awful lot more that can be done. And there is a huge difference in different countries across Europe with, resourcing, even their appetite in dealing or tackling cyber criminality. It absolutely varies from country to country.
Just picking up on some of the difficulties, Ben, perhaps you could spend just a couple of minutes before we wrap up, just commenting on whether you think the legislation in this area is fit for purpose. Do we actually have the right tools in place in the UK to deal with cybercrime?
I think, from the perspective of, do we have the tools to prosecute and extradite and prosecute? I think we do, but I also think that there is some force in the argument that the Act ought to be looked at very carefully to ensure that the private sector, which is engaged in improving security, is not at risk of penalisation.
One perhaps last quick question for everybody, a little short answer if you mind. Do you think there's any kind of green shoots at the moment? Are there any kind of positives we can take away looking forward for the next year?
I think the positives are that the cybersecurity industry, given the right resourcing, is able to tackle to some extent the attacks that they see against them. I don't think you necessarily avoid it, but there are lots of good things that the companies can do to prevent and also to recover from cybercrime. So they're my green shoots.
Given the sort of the doom and gloom of this year, actually the green shoots may be, and I think should be, that this could be a ripe opportunity for private industry and law enforcement to form much closer collaborations and start sharing in a much more meaningful way to help both law enforcement and industry tackle some of these issues.
For me, the green shoots are I just think there's just a much greater awareness and knowledge, not only across the industry but in the general public, of the threat that's posed by cybercrime. And I think the greater that people are aware of it and know about it and understand it, the more likely that there is going to be a response from law enforcement, a response from government, as Louise suggested, hopefully in very close collaboration with the private sector.
Thanks, Ben. And I think that brings us to the end of our session. I'd just like to give a final massive thank you to our panelists. It has been fantastic to hear your views, and I look forward to catching up with all of you soon. Take care.
Thank you.